So, Steve, have you ever heard that statistic that 90% of businesses fail?
Yes,
So, I was thinking about that. Do you think it's true?
sort of, but not really. I mean, it's a stat, so yes, there's probably validity to it, but the stats depend on what you're looking at. Actually, just a funny side note, I was looking at an article just yesterday about the beer companies, and their best-selling beer just changed. For 25 years, it had been Bud Light, and now they said, hey, now the best-selling beer is Michelob Ultra. And I was like, well, wait a minute. Actually, I'd heard it was Modelo Especial, and it depends on what data you're looking at. The first one was by volume. In other words, who sold the most gallons of beer. The second one, Modelo Especial, is actually number one by dollar. So as with any stats, it's one of those where it just depends on what you're looking at. So is it possible that 90% of businesses fail? Yeah, but you probably got to go deeper to understand a little bit better.
Well, yeah, one of the things I look at is certainly when you think about a statistic, we have that general statistic, but if that were accurate, how is it that we have your McDonald's or your Starbucks or your Targets or your Amazons? There's some big companies out there, some businesses that have succeeded. Are those the only ones? Or are there small businesses that succeed too? And that made me think, well, wait a minute, how do we define failure? Where does this idea actually come from? And from that perspective, so, what would you say if you actually look at that data?
Well, again, when you talk about, did Starbucks succeed and McDonald's? I'm like, yeah, but there could very easily be, for every Starbucks, there's probably 10 chains that are succeeding, but there's only 20, coffee shops instead of, however many thousand they have, and then there could be another 100 that they got started and didn't make it. So it's possible. But again, one of the most repeated stats about business failures, maybe one of the most misunderstood. And I think it's because people don't really understand what the definition of failure is when they look at the statistics. So is that what you're wanting clarification on? Or
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about.
yeah.
And I think it's important, right, that we really look at how we're defining failure in this case,
Yeah.
because failure or success can mean different things to different people as well. And so if you were to elaborate on that, what would you say?
Yeah. So if my understanding is the 90% failure rate is any business that got started that is not making money 5 years later. Okay. Seems like a pretty obvious definition, but I'll share 2 or 3 different scenarios that doesn't factor in. One of them is, there's businesses where they got formed and they never did anything. I mean, I have 4 businesses where we started down a path. I liked the name, and actually one of the easiest ways to kind of reserve a name, at least in the state, is to register that business. And so you register that business name. And then I live here in Indiana. I can go online. It takes me 5 minutes. It's $89, and I have a business. So it's really easy, and now I own that name for that business. And I've done that many times, dozens and dozens of times over the years, and I know I've got at least 4 of them that I never really did anything with. Are those businesses a failure? I spent $89 and never did anything with it. According to the stats, that company didn't make money, therefore it's a failure. That's one example. Another example was I started one. I was going to partner with somebody on it, and we got it founded, set it up with Secretary of State. It's there, but I ended up having a disagreement, and I didn't think he was really going to be the best partner, so decided not to proceed with it. Is that business a failure? Maybe, because we didn't make any money, because we never did anything. We never spent $1. Another example is I actually started one with a partner, wonderful partner. We put some money into it, did a little research and due diligence, and we hired an attorney to check on some legalities. It had to do with lending and some rules and regulations. And we spent about $3,000 and determined that what we really wanted to do couldn't be done from a legal standpoint, as far as the structure and just some complications. So we spent $3,000, found out it doesn't work, and we didn't move forward. Was that a failure? Maybe. But if you look at the statistics, all of those are examples of what that 90% failure rate would say is a failure. Now, I've seen other statistics that show that failure rate is probably closer to maybe 50%, not 90. Well, that's a pretty big difference. But then you take one step further and you look at franchises. Well, franchises have a 95% success rate because when you buy a franchise, you're getting instructions. You're getting, here's the steps, the processes, the methodology that works. Again, you go start a McDonald's franchise, you probably have way more than a 95% success rate because they know, I jokingly tell people the size of the fries, the temperature of the oil, how many seconds it goes in there, how many seconds it can, everything down to a science. And that's the beauty of a franchise. And so if you're buying a business that's a franchise, your success rate is very high. And so I think those statistics are quite a bit misleading.
Well, yeah, when I really think about that, we have this habit, and it's not just this business statistic here, but there's a lot of different potential statistics where it's always fascinating. Sometimes you have those scenarios where two different opposing sides can manage to use the same statistics to argue a different point. That's always fascinating. But really, what kind of we're seeing here is that people are repeating scary numbers without really asking what they actually measure. And then, there's a huge misunderstanding. And so really part of what we're talking about is like effectively the zombie LLC. It's something you created it. You thought, hey, maybe I'd get to this, but you're still in the ideation phase,
right,
versus actually being in that position where you're ready to go and fully jump all the way into it. And so you mentioned, from that perspective that, when we really take those away, from the perspective of, the government, right? This is a failed business,
yeah,
but it's really something altogether different.
yeah.
You know,
Honestly,
my,
my opinion
yeah,
is that most businesses don't fail. Most businesses never launch.
right. It's effectively, this wasn't a failure as much as an idea that never got off the ground.
Right.
And so, that's why they say that classic thing, an LLC isn't a business in that sense. It's a receipt from the government. And so from that
Yeah.
perspective, you've hit your first milestone, but there's 10 other milestones behind it. And, there's a few different things to dive into there when we think about this topic. But one of the things that I think we'll see that we come back to as we look a little deeper at this is the reality of perseverance, which is that, it doesn't happen overnight. The first step might be that LLC, but there's all these other things that you have to do after it. And that really comes back to this core concept of resources.
Yeah. True.
And really, for a business to be successful, we need resources. I think that reminds me, there's that classic saying that people have a fear of failure, and that's very relevant when we think about resources as well. Do you want to speak on that?
Yeah. Again, people do have that fear of failure, and part of it, it's not just that they don't want to not succeed. A lot of it's image. They don't want people to see them fail. And so it's not just, if it's one of those where if I was going to, try and do something here in my house and fail, okay, that's annoying. But if I'm doing something where, okay, 5,000 people are watching, the entire community sees it, and he opens a business and that fails, that's very different. So I think part of that is, people have that fear of failure because of their image. But what happens is it's those resources, like you said. To have a successful business, there's three resources. These are the most important resources on the planet. It's time, capital, and knowledge. And if you don't have all those resources, it's hard to have a successful business. If you don't put any time into it, it's not going to work. If you have no capital, businesses, they talk about a shoestring budget and things like that. And yeah, you can try and squeak by, but it's really hard to grow a business with no capital whatsoever. And so you got time, you got resource, you got capital, and you got knowledge. Again, you have to know that business, you have to know business in general. And when you put these together, I think where it comes back to that fear of failure is that people look at, people realize it's going to take all that. And they're like, gosh, I don't have that. I don't have enough capital, or I don't have enough knowledge to run a business. And therefore, I'm not going to gamble on that because I'm afraid I'm going to fail. And so I think it all kind of comes back to the fear of failure, but it's because they're lacking some of those resources such as time, money, and knowledge.
Well, from that perspective, it kind of goes back to the idea of feasibility. A feasibility analysis is something that you and I have discussed before, particularly offline. But, when we really look at an idea, the starting point is you may have a great idea, but now you need that runway to execute on that idea. And it's not just, that you need potentially capital or that knowledge, but you also need that time to put it all together. And so, there's that classic quote is roughly, the greatest thing to fear is fear itself. And to me, what that has always meant is that things are very scary when they're unknown.
Yeah.
And we are able to overcome that fear if we start making it known, understanding exactly what we need to do, what we're facing, and so forth. And relating that to business, we can have this sort of scenario where, well, I have this great idea, but then I don't know these things. And okay, now I realize I need X amount of capital to make this a success. But how do I get that? And now that becomes very scary to try to
Right.
solve.
Right.
Uh,
That's why
you know,
the way I would put it is that good ideas are common, but the execution is rare. To your point, people have the ideas, but since they don't have that knowledge, they don't execute. They don't know. They sometimes don't know how to. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And there's that actually takes me to thinking about, one of the other challenges with a potential failure of a business. It, if we look at it in grade school, right, you can get an A, B, C, on a test, or you can get an F. That F is really where we define failure. But in business, there are times where, in terms of opportunity cost, getting a B or C may not actually make it worth continuing to utilize this business relative to other opportunities.
mm-hmm.
I think sometimes that's what people run into too. If your business is making, $20,000 a year, and that is your sole source of income,
Right.
in terms of opportunity costs, there's potentially other things out there that might make more sense for you, unless you can really build off of that business as, an actual opportunity. Is that something as an entrepreneur for yourself that you think about much? Is this an opportunity worth doing, in terms of the math or the calculus?
Absolutely. And again, a lot of it is there's only so many hours in the day. And so I get multiple opportunities across my desk. Again, I do a lot of networking, I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, business owners, investors, see a lot of opportunities. And, so many of them sound great. But then, you got to have a filter for like, okay, well, wait a minute. How much am I, what's the time commitment to this? Does it really make sense? Again, someone showed me one just the other day that, I could probably do it in 5 to 10 hours a week and make some really good money. But that's 5 to 10 hours a week that I'm not doing something else, that I'm not taking care of an existing business or, doing something like that. And so there's that opportunity cost. So yeah, you really do have to look at that as, okay, not just, is it something you want to do? Is it something you can make money doing? But can you make enough money doing it to justify the hours that you put into it?
Right. And I think some of that goes back to there's oftentimes so many inflection points within business, having that sort of conviction. And it's kind of a timely example, right? We have SpaceX, they had their recent IPO. And we now have, at least currently, based off of the overall market prices, right? We have our world's first trillionaire in Elon Musk. And the reason why this is a timely example is because people can look at that and say, that's really cool. And wow, must be nice. But they don't think about the journey that it took to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And do you happen to know when SpaceX was first incorporated?
It was, I saw something, it was way earlier than I originally thought it was, like 20 years or something. It was
2000, yeah.
2002, yeah.
And so there's a contrast to think about here.
Overnight success.
Exactly. And one of those interesting contrasts, right, is the difference. That's why people go into potential proven or franchise models. The payoff isn't quite the same, right? You're not necessarily going to become a trillionaire from it. But on the flip side to that, you have someone where they've already worked out the kinks over a number of years
Right.
or decades, which allow them to be positioned to succeed. But I remember one of the things that was always fascinating about when we look at SpaceX in general is that they would often show, hey, there's another rocket that blew up. And, we're talking about failure here. And yet we have this situation where they're broadcasting their failure for everyone to see. But one of the lessons for SpaceX there was they said every failure data point, right, is an opportunity to succeed. Mm-hmm. And I think there's actually some interesting things to think about that within business in general. But I want to say it wasn't until around 2015 that, they were successful in kind of getting their rockets to not blow up. So that's 13 years. That's a long time. And obviously the company is more than just rockets today. Mm-hmm. You think about Starlink, they've added in, the AI components. What?
Yeah, the satellite network is huge. It's, yeah.
Right. And they've even talked about, one of the newer ideas is having data centers in space. But if we think about the core concept, I think to someone listening or really thinking about this conversation, they say, well, yeah, of course it would have taken 20 years to do this. It's rocket science. But I'd look at it one other way to think about it as we kind of continue this discussion. And there's another interesting milestone for a business, and that was MrBeast, right? He just hit 500 million subscribers on YouTube. That's a huge number. And one of the things that he talked about on his journey, right, because it took him more than 10 years to go from just having a few subs to a lot of subscribers. But one of the things that he talked about is that classic saying that there are effectively, to get good at anything takes at least 10,000 hours. Mm-hmm. You've heard that before, right? And, if you think about that from your own journey, can you think about examples of where, you were good at something sooner than, 10,000 hours or an outlier or anything like that?
I guess there's a good or really good, or it's a sliding scale. Things that we're competent at in less than 10,000 hours maybe, but to be really good, that's a very common statistic. One of the things I've told people before, I kind of joke about, is sometimes I'm better off being dumb. Early in my career, I knew I was pretty smart, so I'd hear an idea and I'd try and figure it out. And so it's like, I can figure this out. And a lot of times it didn't work. And because I was, taking someone else who had put in 10,000 hours and was really good at it and thinking, okay, well, that makes sense. I can figure out how to do this. Again, use, the wheel example. They spent all that time inventing the wheel. I'm like, that's a good idea. I'll figure out how to do that. And it doesn't work. You can't take those shortcuts. And that's why you've either got to, put in the time or, work with someone who has put in the time, or you have to, again, just work with someone else who has already done it. So there's a few things there, but yeah, it's hard to just take a shortcut and avoid all that learning experience.
Well, I think that's the big thing to think about back from that perseverance angle, right? Is that, we have two different examples. We brought up SpaceX first, and then you say for any naysayer out there, say, well, that's rocket science. Of course it would take forever, right? We go back to something else and we say YouTuber. A lot of people say, well, that's not too hard, to post a video on the internet. Well, Jimmy, right, MrBeast, was posting for 3 years before he ever really got any sort of traction. And then he built off of that and was almost fanatical in his approach to really attack it to become something huge as he is today. But I think what you said there is a really interesting and fascinating point to think about, from the perspective of we're talking about trailblazers and what it takes to become that trailblazer. But then you have that ability to potentially franchise or use someone else's iteration to be able to speed up that process. And I know you and I have talked about a few different, Warren Buffett quotes that are somewhat relevant within this conversation. Is there anything that you would want to share that kind of comes to mind?
As far as a Warren Buffett quote, the one I was thinking of is really just the importance of having a business in your portfolio. He talks about, most people would rather, won't dedicate 3 years of their life to creating a business, but instead, they'll spend 40 years contributing to somebody else's. And it goes back to just that independence. And we don't all have to be Elon Musk. Not every business has to be completely unique, different, special, compared to everybody else's, and a earth-shattering idea that no one else has ever done. That's not what most businesses are. There's a few of them, but not many. Most businesses are something that already exists, and it's just a different iteration, a different branding, a different approach, slightly nuanced or whatever. And there are thousands and thousands of those businesses that are doing really well. And so I think that goes back to the fear part, is people think about, well, I don't even know what business to create. Pick something that's already there and working and create your own version of it. And I think that's, going back to Warren Buffett, he talks about the power of creating wealth by owning a business. But that fear of failure, a lot of people just don't take that step because they're afraid they don't have the knowledge or the skill or the capital to do so.
Well, I think, building on that, there's a few different things to think about, the Buffett strategy, right? Where he would, buy a business, right? And then within that business, he would have the lieutenants who are running the day-to-day operations of the business that were experts in what they were doing.
Right.
And, there's a lot of quotes or half quotes with Buffett, but, one of the things that he also talked about was this idea of when we are looking at, the difference between, hey, you get this new car every 3 to 5 years. How do you treat that car if you know you're going to get another car in 3 to 5 years? Versus you can pick any car you want. And with that car, the one thing is you're going to have it for the next 40 years. How much more aggressive are you going to be in terms of making sure you have regular maintenance and you have, you take care of it, each and every day? And if we take that same analogy and think about that in business terms, I think there's something striking there. If we're constantly thinking about the next idea before we fully hone the idea that we have, then we're never going to get anywhere, because we literally have this example. It sounds great to have this $1 trillion IPO, but what's not so great is, for a decade having everyone watch your rockets blow up on TV. You had to go through that first. So when we're talking about the value of, thinking about running a business or trying to speed up that process by jumping into a franchise system, that's something that cannot be forgotten. It's very rare for there to be a franchise system where they haven't become experts for a decade or more before they really launch, that to bring in franchisees.
Yeah.
And from that perspective, we think about taking that home a little bit. Do you have examples of franchise systems that you have experience in or have worked with?
Well, I'm actually going to go back and share a couple of examples and then remind me, make sure I get into that if I lose track and forget.
Sure.
But I was talking to someone that I've known for a long time who's really struggled financially, and it just reiterates one of my observations that I've had for years. People who struggle financially, they're planning next week and next month and not much more. The people who are successful, they're looking out years, decades, and generations on here's how we're going to create this, build this, grow this. And again, time flies. Next thing you know, that 5-year plan, you're there. So if you've got a 5-year plan that's going to, create wealth, that's going to do this and that, next thing you know, it's been 5 years and you're in great shape. But if all you're doing is looking out, what am I going to do this week or this month? It's like planting a tree. It's like, I don't have time for the tree to grow, so I'm never going to plant seeds. And so she just, unfortunately she'd never planted seeds because she never had the time to wait a week or a month for it to grow. And so she never planned far enough out. And so I see that also in business, where people are looking at a business. Hey, I'm going to start a business. What am I going to do next week and next month? Well, hold on. Where do you want this business to be in 1 or 3 or 5 years? I have no idea. I'm just going to run it right now. Well, you can't do that, because you have to look at a business. Where is it going to be when it's mature? Is it a business you're going to create to sell, to just provide cash flow? I mean, if all you're doing is creating a job, maybe you need to stick with the job you have. But if you're creating a business, can run itself. And so you build these systems, the processes, so that, okay, I've got the operations, I've got the marketing, I have this, and I've got a COO that does this, and a CMO that does this, and a CEO that does this, and you own it, and they're doing the work. Now you have a business that runs on its own, and that's how it creates and builds equity. But that is something you achieve by looking further down the road and creating a plan. And so all that just to say, when you approach a business, again, it's not a 1 month thing. You've got to have a plan to do that. Now, it helps if you go into a franchise. And so kind of back to your question, when you look at franchises or similar models, something that's worked a couple hundred times, a couple thousand times, then now you've got a lot more reassurance. You don't have to worry about, your knowledge, do I have enough knowledge to run this business? Well, follow the instructions. Don't do like I did and try and think it over. Follow the steps, and so you follow the instructions. That's the beauty of a franchise, a beauty of people who've been there before and they've done it, they've created it, and you follow the steps. That's still a business. That still generates cash flow. That still generates equity, but it takes all that hard work and heavy lifting off your plate. So that's how I look at franchises from that standpoint. Not sure if that answered your question or not.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, if we look at those two different examples, so a YouTube creator who's expanded beyond that into a variety of different things, and, a rocket scientist, so to speak, who has expanded beyond that into a variety of things. In both instances, I think that it's fair to say that, to get to where they had that 100,000 hours of expertise or even 50,000 hours of expertise, because you're talking about things they've done for a decade plus. That's a long time. Most people, if they're doing it 40 hours a week over a year, that's roughly, 2,000 hours over 1 year that they're
Right.
working on something. And so if we use that simple math example, that's 5 years just to get to 10,000 hours.
That's right.
And so there's a certain grind mentality that's necessary to become truly, an outlier or an expert in a given thing. But along the way, I think we have to look at those learning opportunities. Making thousands of mistakes along the way is what you have to do to really hone that and make something very good. But the most important thing that you have to look at within that is you need to be in position to be able to recover from those mistakes, right? It goes back to that resource problem. You can't make a mistake and have it destroy your business overnight. You have to be positioned in a way where as a mistake happens, you can learn from it and make a better product or service as part of that. The other thing that you mentioned went back to service, meaning that when we look at, the servicing of a business, the operations of it, making it replicable, that's where a lot of the equity value comes in. For it to not be a job for the founder or the entrepreneur long term, it has to be a process where it can multiply beyond what they're doing. And so, when we think about that, both from your own personal entrepreneurial journey and just within this broader discussion point, and we think about that resource problem, like how do we approach it to be able to survive mistakes and learn from those mistakes?
So a couple things. You mentioned the 10,000 hours. Again, that can be daunting for a business owner. It's like, man, I've got to put 5 years into this before I get it right. And so, yeah,
Mhm.
if you're going to do something new on your own and figure it out as you go, then yeah, it takes a while. But that goes back to that franchise model where you learn from other people's mistakes. What was that? I think you've used this quote before. You say, a smart man learns from his mistakes. A brilliant man learns from the mistakes of others. When you
Right.
step into a franchise, they've already made the mistakes. They've already figured that out. And so you do get to cut those corners. You do get to save that time. And that's the beauty of doing something. Again, it doesn't have to be a franchise, but just some business partner or structure where you're taking advantage of someone else's knowledge, someone else's time that they've already put into it to accelerate your journey. And that's one of the things that I show a lot of people how to do. They don't realize that there's businesses that can be started where it's only taken an hour or so a week of your time because you're delegating, you're bringing on an expert who's done this a couple hundred times, who has that knowledge, who has put the time into it. And they've got the systems, they've got the processes. And so when you can do that, you can start creating wealth without nearly as much of your own time. The formula for wealth that I tell people is it's time multiplied by capital multiplied by knowledge. And the mistake a lot of people make is they're only using their time, their knowledge, and their capital. But you can learn to use other people's money, other people's capital, other people's time, and other people's knowledge to accelerate your wealth creation. That's how you get more leverage and you make a lot more wealth. And so that's what I'd encourage people to take a look at is how can you own a business where someone else is doing all the work? The franchise that reduces that fear of failure, that model that's been replicated before. So instead of a 90% failure rate, you've got a 95% success rate. And so when you start looking at that, other people's knowledge, again, other people's time, that's how I would approach most businesses these days as far as the kind of the easy button, if you will, to get involved in a business ownership.
Well, some of that is almost a personality trait. Talk about, we mentioned, one last example, thinking of those outliers, right? Whether we're talking about an Elon Musk or MrBeast, like in both of those sort of cases, what they did is they treated cash somewhat in the same way. It's not a tool to buy a sports car, it's fuel to buy more hours on the racetrack, so to
Yeah,
speak. And when we look at that, it's a certain type of personality type that's what they want to do. They want to grow bigger and bigger. Whereas there's a lot of other people who certainly they want to see growth, but they don't necessarily want to be the next $1 trillion IPO.
right,
Instead, what they want to do is they want to build reasonable amount of wealth for their lifestyle. And
right,
so from that perspective, that's the shift is if you're trying to have, the entire pie, so to speak, there's a model where you have to make various other resource sacrifices.
hmm,
Whereas if instead what you're looking at is as, another source in your portfolio or this opportunity to get potentially more than a W-2 job, but you're not necessarily focused on that being the only thing that you're doing with your lifestyle,
right,
then that's where the franchising model that you talk about can be very helpful in terms of that adjustment to the overall risk reward calculus. Is that kind of the way that you would think that through?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so, I even, when I talk to investors, I talk about, so I'll take a step back. The two ways you create wealth are with owning a business or owning real estate. And if you're going to own a business, there's a couple ways you can do that. You can own one that is active, Elon Musk or MrBeast, where you're running it. That is what you're doing. That is your business, your baby that you're going to grow. Or it's passive. All right, I can have someone else who runs most of this business, does most of the work. And yeah, you're not going to have quite the scaling ability, quite the success, but you're going to have a lot more time freedom to enjoy the cash flow that's being generated. And so it's just for each person kind of figuring out what is the best fit for me, what direction to move forward, what makes sense. And so that's where I talk to a lot of investors and help you kind of figure out what is a good fit for you. So that's kind of where I bring it back to. Anyone who has any questions about that, gosh, I'm not sure what kind of a business may or may not be a fit for me, reach out to me. That's what we're here for. So,
well, I one of the things that, again, we've talked about, some interesting, the biggest in their field, between MrBeast and SpaceX. But then you have this other side, some of the other business things that you're talking about. And there was a quote that I once heard, I don't know who it would be attributed to, but I thought it was fascinating nonetheless, which is that, people start businesses with a 3-month mindset and expect a 30-year result. And if there's anything that we've talked about here is that if you are literally a startup versus part of an existing already defined process with the SOPs and so forth, it is going to be a much longer road. And so that's something that someone has to be very much prepared for. But then there's the flip side to it. And sometimes I've heard about the idea of following someone's system or a franchise, being a franchisee. And, the way that people look at that is that it's almost boring. A successful business almost looks boring because it's so dialed in. There's much less of that iterative approach that needs to be dealt with because it's a well-oiled machine.
right.
And it's not to say that, there are 100-year-old companies that occasionally get into trouble because they don't evolve over time. But, from that bandwidth problem, if you have many of these steps already set up for success, and it's just a matter of, so to speak, the sports analogy, blocking and tackling so that you can run for touchdowns, it makes it much easier to have bandwidth to focus on continuing to evolve as you're moving along. And so, that kind of takes me, to that concept. Beyond, the replication factor, is there anything else there that you look at for why some businesses survive versus others that are fail that we haven't talked about yesterday?
Honestly, we could do an entire show just on that. Yeah, why businesses have specific examples of what has worked, what's not worked, why some have failed. Again, it can be anything from capital to time to poor marketing, lack of feasibility study, lack of. There's a lot of reasons they could fail, but then there's also steps that have been put together. Here's kind of what you follow to make sure you don't fail. So even if it's not a franchise, make sure you do this first. All right, do the feasibility study. Okay, do some testing. There's processes to follow. But yeah, as far as what could cause a business to fail, there's quite a few of them, but they can all be avoided with a good plan. So
yeah, I don't know if you had any potential personal anecdotes that you wanted to share within that topic, but I know one time, the discussion point has always been that every business is going to encounter problems.
mm-hmm.
A business doesn't fail when it encounters problems. It fails when the owner stops solving them.
Yeah.
And if you think about it from that perspective, like, is there anything that you would look at or take away or kind of want to share, on that concept?
I can share an example from the last year. I came out with a product on Amazon, and it was actually blood pressure monitors. And just so I'm selling those online. That's one of the products I have. One of the little side businesses I put about an hour a week or less into, and it started selling. Did really good the first few weeks, and then our sales plummeted. And it turned out that we went from having a rating of like 4.6 or 4.7 stars to having a rating of like 2.3 stars. So nobody would buy it. What we found out was that Well, so first of all, some business owners would look at that, hey, we tried, this sucks, and they don't solve the problem. To your point, that business could have easily failed. It's like, okay, gosh, we don't know what's going on, this sucks. Well, we tried, and walk away with a big loss. But what we did is we did research and figured out, we were able to determine it was actually our competitors sabotaging us. And they were leaving 1-star reviews because we were taking sales away from them. And so we were able to file an appeal with Amazon and prove that these were not legitimate customers, and they weren't even using the right pictures of the product pictures, but they were trying to sabotage our product. Amazon looked at it and they realized you're right, and they removed all those reviews back to 4.6, 4.7 stars, back to selling, and the business has done great. But to your point, a business will have challenges, and if the owner doesn't find solutions, then yeah, that could lead to failure. So part of it is that that dedication and that willingness to do what it takes to make things work.
Right. Everyone is going, it goes back to the persistence, overcoming adversity, that's a big part of it. And, I guess if we think through that, right, your goal, with your blood pressure monitor business was not just to start a business, right? What was your actually goal for that business?
I mean, it's cash flow and equity. And so, I spent about $25,000 to start the business. And I will say that 10 months after I started it, sales were up and going. It was making money. It was cash flowing. And somebody offered me $150,000 for the business. To ooh, a business that's making X dollars per month and it's already operational, working, systems in place, processes in place. Yeah, I'll pay for that. I didn't sell it. I ended up holding out, and I'll probably end up selling it for quite a bit more than that. But I built it to generate cash flow and to create equity. Because once you've got cash flow and it's a profitable business, that creates equity. The business is now worth something and can be sold later.
Well, this kind of goes back to some other discussions that we have had before, right? There's a difference between just something creating income and something creating a mechanism or a vehicle to build wealth. And, it goes back to the idea of growing wealth versus creating wealth. And, from that perspective, if you really dive into that equity concept for a lot of these businesses, and that's effectively no different from all the people who spent the last 10 years at SpaceX. I saw a news article that talked about a SpaceX welder who had a certain amount of shares that, here he is a decade later, and he's now a millionaire based off of the closing price of the stock yesterday. He was a welder. He didn't expect anything. He was a contractor when he first started working with them, got some shares, and that's transformative for someone who's making significantly yet less from year to year. If you just want to dive into, that concept of equity a little bit more, what it means to you and what it should mean to everyone else, what would you say?
Again, it's creating wealth. Again, my plan is to sell that business for probably in the $300,000 to $500,000 range later this year. My startup cost was $25,000. And so in a period of 16 to 18 months, turning 25 into, call it 400, that's a really good return. That is in a year and a half. And so you're creating wealth and you're creating that equity, because there are companies, and frankly, the bigger you are, the higher what they call the multiple. And again, it's a whole other topic. We can get into how to sell a business and how multiples and valuations work. But bottom line is, the bigger it is, there are hedge funds, there's other people with deep pockets. They don't want to start from scratch. They want to buy an existing operating cash flowing business. And so there's a lot of value in taking it from zero to cash flowing, which can be done in 18 to 24 months. And now it's the people with deep pockets go, ooh, an operating business? Yeah, I'll pay quite a bit for that. And so that's kind of the model from the equity standpoint.
Well, no question, whether we're talking about, traditional, very large companies that buy startups who have figured out a great idea, why reinvent the wheel if we can just effectively capture it by buying this company? And it's the same thing when we look at, products within the product business is, hey, if you've already created demand for this product, if you have this sales history, right, this profitability, the vendor relationships, all those different pieces, then now you have something that we can skip those steps and realize the benefits and scale it further by potentially trying to expand this into other markets, by potentially going and having 100,000 units of this product at once, whatever they're trying to do. it's nice when you already have something from their perspective that has been proven.
Right.
You've done all the validation, you put in all the work for that. So that's why something like that works. But within you, right, your own calculus, you were able to solve the resource problem that so many potential entrepreneurs run into there, right? You were able to figure out how to solve for the time and the capital and the knowledge necessary to make that business a success.
Yeah.
And what I'm left with there then is, part of the lesson that we started at within this conversation is, do we have some misleading statistics here, and do 90% or more of businesses fail? And maybe the lesson isn't that businesses are too risky. Maybe it's that we actually misunderstand what failure looks like altogether. Steve, do you have any kind of final thoughts on what we've talked about today?
Yeah, you're completely right. Again, the definition of failure, like I said, it's a lot of those a business could be a name that was purchased and never used. I mean, that's not really a failure. And it didn't even get launched. But as far as businesses that have been launched, that followed a system like a franchise, the results are really good. And I think the fear, it comes back to the unknown. And I'll share a quick example. Over the years, I've got a wife who's a pharmacist, really knowledgeable, knows her field, and I've shown her numerous startups. And she kind of looks at, no, that looks risky. That looks risky. And the first one that she ever said, that looks like a great idea, it was in the pharmaceutical industry because she understood it. And so it's one of those where it doesn't mean all the others were bad ideas, because actually some of them have done quite well. But she didn't have the knowledge of those. And so fear of the unknown, well, gosh, I don't know that tech stuff. That looks risky to me. But it wasn't until I showed her something that was in the pharmaceutical industry, she understood it. She didn't have that fear of the unknown, and she was much more comfortable. So again, I think the fear of failure, a lot of it's the fear of the unknown. And so, when you do something that's been replicated many times, it helps reduce that fear of the unknown, gain a little education, learn about it, and overcome those fears. Because as Warren Buffett said, it's better to work for 3 years and build a business than work 40 years building somebody else's.
Right, exactly. I think that's something that can resonate for a lot of people. The one other way that I'd look at that is that, the lesson, nothing here that we talked about is about ignoring risk, right? Really, the lesson is to stop letting, misunderstood statistics prevent you from even pursuing opportunities. And I think that's something that, you have talked about with people over the years, which is that if you're not taking any sort of action, how can you expect to generate any sort of results?
Right.
And if you think about whether we're talking about, your book, or, we're thinking about, some of the different things you've said on that topic before, I think that's part of this puzzle. People see that statistic and they do nothing because it's big and scary. But if you think about it from a, got to take action perspective, from a mindset perspective, what would you end on, as we wrap up here?
Well, again, part of it is overcoming the fear, and part of it is that, again, to your point, it doesn't mean it's risk-free, but there's risk mitigation. Yes, a business still has risk, but if you follow certain steps, even if it's not a franchise, there are certain steps that you follow to start and run a successful business. And you follow those steps, that's going to reduce that risk greatly. Or if you get a franchise or something that's been done many times, again, that just reduces the risk even more. And so the easiest way to overcome the fear is to have systems in place that reduce that risk. And that's what you're afraid of, the risk of losing, the risk of failure. And so you reduce that risk, and it makes it easier to overcome that fear of failure.
Right. Well, with that, I think that's everything we have for today. Anything else? Any last comments, Steve?
No. Thank you so much, Dave. Appreciate your time. Enjoyable discussion once again.
Great. Catch you guys next time.
Yeah, thank you.